Welcome to the Contracting Officer Podcast. If you work anywhere in the government acquisition world, this podcast is for you. Whether you work for government or industry, we're here to help you understand how the other side thinks. Our mission? To make government contracts better, one contract at a time. This episode is brought to you by Skyway Acquisition Solutions. Skyway helps you know more, do more, and win more in the government market. To learn more, visit skywayacquisition.com. Today, we return to our series of interviews with former government contracting officers who share their personal 3 things I wish I'd known when I worked for the government. I set Kevin loose with the mic and he interviewed Floyd Smith, a friend of Kevin's who's a retired Army officer and former contracting officer. Floyd retired in 2009 and now works on the industry side of the government acquisition world. All right, let's get started and learn from Floyd's experience.
Welcome, Floyd, to the Contracting Officer Podcast.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Kevin.
So to give people a feel of just how awesome you are, because I've known you for a while, so give them kind of a feel of your history as a contracting officer and how things went since you retired, or even before you retired.
Okay. Kind of let me set the stage and how I even got into this contracting business, contracting world. I was, again, an officer in the United States Army. Most officers who get into contracting as an Army officer, you have to wait till you're at least a captain to do all the jumping out of planes and kicking down doors and using the weapon systems that we usually and now acquire. I was a tanker, an armor officer, and it really honed in on how important what we buy, how we buy it, does it meet specs, and all that kind of stuff once I become a contracting officer. So I was asked by the United States Army to come into the acquisition corps as a young captain. There are different fields you could go in, programmatics or program or contracting or IT. I chose contracting. It seemed to be interesting. And from there, I went to all of the DOE certification courses and achieved the certification required to be a contracting officer. And from there, I went through major buying commands to contingency contract, and we'll talk about some of that deployments. And I have enjoyed the journey, and I continue to enjoy the journey, although every day is not a rose garden.
So what is the coolest, or I'll go with most interesting thing you bought when you were a contracting officer?
Well, serving in major buying commands is one thing where you learn and hone your skills to do normal contracting. But as an Army contracting officer, I would have to say my deployment to Uzbekistan and Afghanistan as the director of contracting in support of Operation Enduring Freedom. Responsible for contingency contracting operations in support of a combined joint task force supporting some 10,000 U.S. coalition forces was pretty amazing, pretty daunting, and sometimes downright scary.
Wow. So to back up a second, so what is a contingency contracting officer? Most people don't know what that is.
A contingency contracting officer could be either military and in today's environment, civilian, because when the war kicked off, as you know, we've been in Iraq and Afghanistan fighting war on terrorism for over 10 years. But initially, the military deployed contracting officers that were warranted contracting officers in the United States. They sent them to, at that time, special training so that they understand contingency operations embedded with a combat unit to exercise and execute contracting authority on behalf of the United States government or on behalf of the units for goods and services that they needed in a theater of operations. And that was a big thing then because they didn't have enough, because we kicked off a war, contracting officers or contingency contracting officers, as people started getting trained to be, to go into the theaters where you could get shot at but still procure things that were not on a military organizational training and equipment list. Normally, units go with all their stuff that they're supposed to, but as we learned from Vietnam, you can't bring everything. And when you get in a theater, Iraq, Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, the Philippines, there are certain things that we as contracting officers can acquire in that country to support those forces. And that's when you become a contingency contracting officer with special thresholds to conduct those contracting and buying activities.
So you're basically on the ground in the combat zone buying all kinds of stuff, from food and water to vehicles and ammo and who knows what, but just whatever's needed, right?
Well, we do have some limitations. Cannot buy vehicles, but we could
See,
lease
I
them.
I haven't done that particular role, so that's an example of the things I don't know. I don't know.
If you did that, yeah, we would be in trouble. But but we could lease, like in Afghanistan and Iraq. You see a lot of them running around in those Toyota Hiluxes, or now Special Ops. We have, I think they have purchased some now in the theater. But at the time I was in the AOR, the Area of Operations, we were leasing them for the soft guys that I was supporting, because sometimes it was conventional, sometimes I was doing support for soft operators. And yes, I was able to train and appoint field ordering officers, which these guys and mostly guys would act on my behalf with simplified acquisition threshold to go out into we call outside the wire, and goods and services or supplies they didn't have, I would appoint them, and then a pay agent would also be available with a slew of cash, $25,000, $30,000, to go with them, separate but a team, because you don't mix the money with the require. And that field owner officer would act with my authority to buy things at the micro purchase limit. And those are the kind of things we would give the combatant commander in the field the ability to do, a force multiplier with me in the theater, able to contract with BPAs for dining facility, life support, building and structures, temporary structures, wood to build things, some medical supplies, depending on if the medical officer was there. We could help with the locals, all kinds of things that we needed to support operations, but only a warranty contracting officer could provide with binding or writing purchase orders or BPAs to do those things. And
BPA, for those of you, is a blanket purchase agreement. So it's basically an agreement to buy stuff at a fixed price.
And in order against that agreement. Yes, sir.
Okay. Wow.
And there was one other thing that I'm happy as a contracting officer was able to do, which was also work as an administrative contracting officer, where I was a Defense Contract Management Agency Syracuse commander, DCMA commander. Most folks know him when they come to work with them on a post award. And as a DCMA commander, I deployed, or was directed to deploy as an ACO to the Philippines to support a joint special operations task force with life support, weird things such as a commercial medevac for some 170 U.S. special operators down in the jungles of the Philippines who were prosecuting terrorists there. So those are the two of the most memorable activities as a KO.
How long were you with DCMA?
I was with DCMA 3 years, deployed for 8 months, and then came back to my command. My deputy ran the organization while I was deployed.
How many times have you been deployed as a contracting officer?
Let's see, 1, 2. When I was, and then 3. I, as a contracting, chief of contracting for Supply and Assistance Branch in Korea, U.S. Contracting Command, Korea. I was assigned there. We went to Thailand, and I deployed there for a repatriation of U.S. forces out of Vietnam, and they were needing contracting guys to help them with some supplies with the State Department and Military Affairs Group there. So 3 times.
Wow.
But I'm sure there are a lot of guys got a lot more deployments on their belt over the years, but those are memorable contracting officer duties, besides working in a buying command where you're buying stuff at a major command.
So yeah, you've got. That's why I wanted to have Floyd on. He's got unique experiences because you've done stuff in the U.S., you've done stuff overseas, you've done stuff in between. You've been deployed a few times, so yeah, you got very cool background. So my favorite question is what are the 3 things you wish you knew when you were a contracting officer? Spoiler alert, we've already kind of talked about what his 3 are, but I'll let you go with the first one here. So what is the first thing that you wish you knew when you were a contracting officer?
I would say do not rush to become a KO or... KO, CO, but as an Army guy, we like to use KO because we do not like to get them confused with CO, commanding officer. So I would say do not rush to become a KO. Serve as a contract specialist as long as you can with a seasoned contracting specialist and learn all you can about contracting basics. As a young captain, when I came in into the acquisition corps and into the contracting field, the first thing I wanted was, hey, where do I sign? I'm a contracting officer. I'm a commander, been a commander. Where do I sign? Because I'm a contracting officer. I was a contract specialist. And I was told by one of these seasoned senior ladies to get over there, sit down, grab that FAR, start putting a solicitation package together, get that file put together back in those days by hand. And I thought she was on something. I'm like, wait a minute, I'm an officer. Where do I sign the good stuff? That is not how it works. That is a great insight.
Yeah, because I remember the same thing as when I got to be like a GS-12. I'm like, okay, well, I've been doing this long enough. I can get my warrant. And then all of a sudden you start to realize the authority that comes with that, the amount of responsibility that comes with that. It's don't be in a race to get there. It's a really great advice from the perspective of you don't know what you don't know.
Exactly.
And it's such a wide open space. One of the early episodes of the podcast that we did was about how someone becomes a warranted contracting officer and all the responsibility that's written into FAR Part 1.6. And when you read it kind of throws you back a bit until you really kind of digest how many things you've got to learn. So that's a great one. So what's your second one?
Let's say, do not let senior officers or senior commanders or general officers direct you to do something you as a KO are not comfortable with, unless it impacts life, security, or safety, or jeopardizes mission accomplishment. You may walk the line of the FAR in some of the ambiguous areas to accomplish the mission, but stay within the FAR, but never, ever violate the law.
And that's one of those that I think people sometimes don't realize, going back to the responsibility part of it, is that the contracting officer is not his boss or his boss's boss or his or her boss's boss's boss, maybe telling him to do things that the FAR doesn't allow for, that law doesn't allow for, that you have to kind of understand what you're signing up for here, right? And your name is on that document forever. And I say that, kind of almost as a reaction nowadays. But I used to have conversations where somebody would say, well, let's just get this done. And I'm like, well, you sign it because I'm not signing it. And that's a hard, and I think a lot of there's a fine line there. You can't be so, full of yourself that you're just being stubborn and not getting anything done. But the fine art of understanding, okay, this is not how it can get done. This over here is how it can get done.
And that's a good point, Kevin. I have seen contracting officers as I was coming up before I got to be a senior acquisition professional that they would get the contracting package in the inbox and it would be there for weeks as they try to contemplate, do they want to sign it? Do they want to move forward? Because they're afraid or there's risk or sometimes out of just, I'm not going to do it because I'm at general is not pushing me. I have the warrant. And yes, you cannot stifle progress or an operation. And at the same time, as a contracting officer, we have no input to the operations or the operator, or if we're buying a tank, a M4 carbine, whatever his equipment is going to be used for in operations, we don't influence how or what they're going to execute it, but we need to give him the equipment. And when he pulls or she pulls that trigger, it better work.
Yeah. At the end of the day, that's what we're here. We're here to enable people to get stuff done.
Yes, sir.
So what's your third one?
Let's see. The third one, I would say, better communication, understanding the PMO's requirement. What is driving the requirement? Even as a young contracting officer, all the way up to lieutenant colonel, when I had a division or a team, there was always issues in regards to a good statement of work or need a current and reasonable IGCEs. The tech eval should be clear and easily understood in accordance with the RFP. What color of money you should be using in regard to what you're buying, O&M, PROC, RDT&E. Better communication and understanding with the program management offices as I transfer into a different area besides just doing contingency stuff is paramount because it impacts on the acquisition or the contracting strategy slipping to the right or redos or the contractor or vendor not understanding clearly or providing a bid that not meeting what the initial requirement is because the government didn't communicate very well what they were wanting. And it continues today, but that's one of the things that I wish I knew as a KO that, hey, I just can't use an old statement of work. I just can't use something that the other person used before me. I should understand what I'm doing there. and talk with the customer.
Yeah, and that's one of the primary tenets of the podcast is driving for more communication. And I mean, you and I talking about this is making people more aware of it. So it's a great example of how easy it is to forget that you're throwing a rock in the pond. And like everybody needs to understand, where those ripples are going and who they're impacting. And it's very
exactly
when you make a decision about something, something theoretically as simple as what color of money applies here. Well, does the person at the other end of that chain who is pulling the money out of the bucket, does he know that?
Right.
Does industry know that and all that kind of stuff?
And that's a good point, Kevin. Industry, most time industry does know that. Sometimes they don't. With my ability to work on both sides of the street in regards to industry, and then working embedded in the SOCOM and the program office, yes, I help the customer or help the SOCOM manage those dollars. And if the industry doesn't understand, what that means, they really need to ask and find out and do some research to find out what the color of money is, because some colors end faster, some color of the money is for sustainment, some is brand new stuff, RDT&E, and your investment into bidding proposals, depending on how and what it is, there could be great opportunities there.
Indeed. So that's a great segue to, okay, so you retired in 2009, and then what is your post contracting officer career been?
See, meeting competing demands, both from industry standpoint and as government, because I'm a government contractor. When I say that, try to meet requirements of limited budget and still enable the customer to meet SOF, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, whatever the mission is. But at the same time, industry with vendor competition and the decreasing DoD acquisition budget environment for what's out there. Now, I'm not saying that there's limitations. There's a lot out there for small business and large business to go for, but it is very competitive now, if I can say that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree. So when you left in 2009, and so what was your experience leaving the Army? And the reason I ask is that we have some of our podcast fans and listeners, they email and ask, I'm getting ready to retire. What do you suggest I do as far as transitioning from either being active duty contracting person or a acquisition professional as a civilian or whatever into what you do? Because you're now as successful on the industry side as you were when you're on the government side.
Kevin, that's a good question. I have to admit, I had huge anxiety, and most of the guys I meet, I'm serious, huge anxiety. You don't know what you don't know, what you think you know, and you really, I would say, we cut ourselves short, because the skills and training, at least from the business standpoint, acquisition and contract, we really have skills besides just kicking down doors or shooting from a tank, and what I was so worried about was, man, I need a job. And what I did was I considered paying a person to do a resume for me, which I decided that was stupid. I sat down in my study. I got all of my evaluation reports and my experiences, put it in one stack, my awards in another, put that stuff in order where I can identify and put it into layman's terms, or I say business and industry terms, so it doesn't have all of the military jargon. Wrote out a resume, and then went to the retirement preparation training that they had. Thought I knew everything when I went to the 3-day training. I did not know everything. I learned that you need to be able to network. You need to know how to properly dress. As a military officer, you think you know how to dress, but sometimes you may come out with a plaid shirt and striped pants and thinking you're looking hot. But
that's a great image. Thank you for that.
You really need to understand how to dress, act, and look professional. And once I sat down and put that together, drew up the resume, I put it on CareerBuilder and Monster.com. I also reached out to, and since I was working at CENTCOM, I think at the time, as a acquisition staff officer to the CG then, I knew some people at SOCOM, so I reached out to them. You must be able to network. They knew I was a contracting officer type, and told them that I was getting ready to retire over at SOCOM in the acquisition center. They also said, send your resume into, posted on US Gov. I did that. And after that, I prayed about it. Next thing I know, I'm on leave probably maybe 30 days, doing a little fishing, kind of liking it, thinking, hey, I'm not in a hurry. And next thing you know, I get a call regarding my resume on monster.com. From my understanding, posting of resumes and then just letting it sit there is not a high percentage of getting a call back. Normally, it's mostly networking, knowing someone, and getting into a position or opportunity that way. But in this case, they called me off of Monster, and then the government also called me in regards to contracting officer positions. And it didn't take long. And I was very happy to get the first call. I was negotiating and working with the salary part, and then I got the government calling, and I had already been hired by industry by then and to be a consultant or DOD contractor. And I went that way instead of going back into the government as a contracting officer.
Oh, cool. That's kind of impressive that you had the forethought to sit down and make two stacks. It's like, this is all the content I already have about me, and here are all the words that I already had about me, and then particularly that's really good advice to take it out of the DOD and in government lingo, and put the business language on it, and that's. I see that a lot. I think I went through the same cycle. I mean, I still kind of struggle with we joke about using acronyms all the time. In fact, by the way, one of the acronyms you use, CG, that stands for Commanding General. For those of you who don't know,
Thanks, Kevin.
And it's funny that when I give presentations, I always if I use an acronym, call me out on it, and I'll define it. So yeah, it's you have to be out of the habit of doing that.
And I try to do the same. I'm glad you called me out on that one because they're using acronyms for such a wide range audience. They will probably write that down and go, now I got to Google it.
That's right. Well, good. At least they can Google it, right? Yeah. So what do you see as the biggest hurdle in the government market for contracting professionals, for the acquisition process, just in general, for government contracting as a whole? What do you see as the biggest challenge?
I would say LPTA best value. Procurement goes through reforms every few decades, but the current environment, from my observation, for both inside the government and from industry's perspective, is pretty bad. There are things that can be done without formal change. Leaders need to lead. Managers, they need to manage, and the workforce must, exhibit some sound judgment and be honest and realistic about what they're trying to do and what they're trying to procure, and what risk is there in trying to do it. I tell you, procurement personnel need to be well trained. The workload must be better managed, because I'm talking to you, and you know what I'm talking about, being in SOCOM.
Yep.
They need to possess a strong problem-solving understanding and skills. We contractors need to help the federal government with its procurement issues and provide the right solutions, and be realistic about what it can do. Over the past 8-10 years, the procurement workforce has shrunk by approximately 20%. And the number of contract actions has changed dramatically and increased. So today's acquisition workforce is, I hate to say this, less trained, more hurried, asked to do more, and that's just the facts. So I would say those challenges are what are in front of us. They can be overcome with good leadership, sound training, and sound judgment, commitment, dedication, because we're still providing U.S. forces with the equipment they need each and every day to do the best job they can to protect this nation.
Yeah, and I see my answer to that is similar to yours, but it's more specific to the training. Is I feel like there are people that are not given enough context and training and access to knowledge about how this market works from both sides. And it's one of the reasons that the podcast is when we get emails from people saying, wow, I never knew how crazy debriefings were from the government side. We've had government people email us and say, wow, I know how to do a debriefing better. And not that we're savants, it's just that we've screwed it up so many times that I can tell you, don't do it this way. That kind of stuff is that's what's missing. It's kind of cool that we're all on the same page. Okay, well then let's flip the coin there. What do you see as the biggest opportunity, the biggest area for good things that are happening in the government market?
Let's see. I would say, despite the recent budget cuts in the U.S. federal marketplace, there's still plenty of room and opportunity for small and large businesses. The federal government typically spends about $500 billion in contracts every year, and the law requires that 23% of that go to small businesses. So, doing business with the large purchase of goods, doing business with the largest purchaser of goods and services, such as the DOD, isn't easy, but there is always opportunity out there if you want to seek it out. And then hook up with great companies like yours, Kevin, to give you some insight on what your product is, what do you have to offer, what niche you're in. Should you all go for that? Is it better to go commercial or a defense contract type of acquisition? And there's opportunity out there, but you have to prepare, you have to look for it, and you have to use the tools out there because it's still opportunity now. But I'm telling you, the listening to Mr. Gertz yesterday at the All Hands SOCOM's acquisition executive and listening to other senior acquisition professionals, it's going to be difficult from a Department of Defense contract budget standpoint. There's still commercial contract requirements out there. There's plenty, but it's going to be a little tight the next couple of years. And then we have a new administration coming on board next year, which we don't know what's going to happen there. I do know one thing will probably happen. That's a CRA, probably extended one. So, we got some wonderful times ahead that there are opportunities embedded. I don't want to sound like a negative nanny or a negative Ned, but that's the facts there, Kevin.
Yeah, and by the way, CRA stands for Continuing Resolution. And so what that means is that Congress doesn't get the budget passed and things drag on and government contracting gets more complicated.
Again.
And so I appreciate the plug for Skyway. But yeah, I'm really... I really appreciate you being candid about the fact that this market isn't easy. It's not for everybody, and it's you have to plan for it. We talk about that a lot with the value of targeting. That's my favorite topic is targeting. Is the market is ideal for targeting, but man, it's brutal to you. It beats you up if you don't target, and that's a lesson that a lot of people end up losing a lot of money to learn.
One thing that I've identified over years in the acquisition community is just because you are technically proficient does not mean you are a leader. That you can lead a team of contracting professionals, manage their workload, prioritize, get the work done, and get it out and get it awarded. There are a lot of moving parts and pieces after you get stamped with a warrant. It doesn't end there. And I'm excited to continue to grow that way.
Because people are going to ask, so what's the best way to get a hold of you? How do we find you?
The best way to get hold of me during the workday is at floyd.smith.ctr at SOCOM.mil. If you email me, I will respond. If you have a question pertaining to anything that I said, I will be happy to respond and help you out.
Awesome. And are you on LinkedIn, I assume?
I am on LinkedIn, yes.
And yeah, and to wrap up, he's here in Tampa Bay. He works at MacDill Air Force Base, and he's been on both sides of defense. And I really appreciate you taking the time to give us, particularly that I really personally enjoyed the whole contingency contracting officer. Because that's such a great description of a role that most people, even people in contracting, have no idea how squirrely that particular, like things like you don't walk out with the money. You have and then somebody else has the money. But by the way, you're walking around with $30,000 in cash through Afghanistan.
Right. That's right. And with security detail, usually I always had a security detail. But you're right. It gets pretty squirrely. When I think back on it, it was pretty squirrely. But I like working for the company I work for now. It's a great time, but I don't think I would want to go back. And I was gung-ho and wanted to do great things with the Navy SEALs down in the Philippines and then some of the Army operators in Afghanistan and Uzbekistan. So it was a great opportunity, but man. But now, you have civilian regular government contracting officers, women and male, that have gone. So that's an improvement because we never have enough military contingency contracting.
That's a good point. And it's a unique skill that it takes time to learn it. And not to mention the fact that it's dangerous.
Yes, sir.
Okay, that's it for another episode of the Contracting Officer Podcast. Thanks for joining us today. And remember, if you have questions, comments, or complaints, send me an email at paul@contractingofficerpodcast.com. One last thing, if you enjoyed what you heard today, please tell a friend. You can help make government contracts better one contract at a time by spreading the word about the podcast. Thanks again.